This lesson is on human impact on the biosphere. As we've talked about many times in class, human population is rapidly increasing. Each generation is larger than the one before it and produces a generation larger than it. So that's more or less what we refer to as exponential growth. And as the human population grows larger, this puts other species at risk because we are depleting more and more resources with each generation. It only makes sense that the more people you have, the more resources are needed to support that larger population. And today, species are disappearing faster than they ever have in recorded history. There have been some mass extinctions in the past that occurred because of rapid changes in conditions on Earth. But as far as recorded human history goes, since us human beings have kept track of what has happened, there hasn't been this many of Earth's animal and plant species disappearing at such a quick rate. So here's some examples of habitat loss. Whenever the habitat that plants and animals belong to is altered significantly, this can cause the species to cease to exist in that area and maybe altogether if their entire habitat is affected. So throughout the 1970s and the 80s, and really this continues on today, the Amazonian rainforests have been cleared to create farmland. I've talked about this many times before that with rainforests, most of the fertility is tied up in that organic layer, the once living things that are on the ground and decaying. That's where the fertility of the rainforest is. And when you remove the trees, you also remove that layer, and the soil beneath is really not that fertile. And it's not really that great for farm use in the first place. So this is a problem. You're taking the habitat away from all of those rainforest creatures and plants and changing it into, changing the landscape into one that is inhospitable towards those species. Um, Also, clearing land for any reason to build cities, towns, um, for any kind of development that destroys habitats. It takes away space for plants and animals to live in. Changes in water temperature and pH that are due to, again, our use of our use of fossil fuels and us putting all this carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and it being dissolved in the oceans. This is destroying a lot of ocean habitats, such as the coral reefs. In addition to the total destruction of habitat, we also have what's called habitat degradation. And this is actually a lot more common. This is very, very common. And this is what happens when pollution damages a habitat. If you just drive around the county here where we live, you can actually witness this. When you see all that trash that's on the side of the road that people throws out, this is what we refer to as habitat degradation. Not only does it look nasty, but it also affects the habitat. It affects the soil when this trash breaks down, and these particles of plastic end up in the soil, end up in the water, in the runoff, and ends up in the streams and the ponds and the lakes. In addition to just that kind of pollution, there's all the other ones we've talked about before: the acid precipitation, surface level ozone, any type of water and soil pollution. So as human population increases, we build more homes, buildings, factories. It degrades the habitat. It reduces biodiversity, and this makes it a lot harder for other species to survive. And eventually, it can, like I've said before in the biodiversity lesson prior to this, it really endangers our ability to survive. And it's unfortunate that most of us fail to see that, and for some folks, it's probably only going to become evident whenever that problem is directly affecting them. Global warming, we've beaten this one over the head many, many times. It can change habitats, it can cause the loss of species. We've talked about how coastal flooding covers up land and takes away living space for animals and plants, and even humans in this case. Global warming, we've talked about how it can increase tropical storms and hurricanes, typhoons, so on and so forth, which often kill wildlife. Um, Heat waves and droughts are also problems associated with global warming that can harm species and their habitats. All right, here's something we haven't talked about before, which is hunting. And this is something that's near and dear to a lot of us living in a rural area like we do. A lot of people enjoy hunting. And hunting is really, it has a lot of advantages. If you're going to eat meat, it's actually one of the greenest ways to acquire meat. We've talked about how large scale farming creates pollution. And animal waste is one of the problems. You keep a lot of animals in one area and they produce a lot of waste, and then it becomes part of the runoff when it rains and causes pollution and so on and so forth. Furthermore, when it comes to raising livestock, a lot of people are concerned about the welfare of the animals, their quality of life. When you hunt and you get your meat right from nature, you're getting an animal that has lived a much better life than something that's kept pent up. Um, and also, those animals, when they're living naturally in their habitat and they're not pent up like that, the waste they produce is more spread out and it doesn't do as much damage to the ecosystem. It really, if any at all. So really, sometimes hunting gets a bad rap from people who don't participate in it, but it's actually a really green way to acquire meat. But if we aren't careful about how much hunting we do and which species we're hunting or not hunting, it can lead to big time problems. And that's what the slide here means by saying unregulated hunting can lead to extinction. If you're hunting the same species over and over and you reduce the number of members of that species, you end up with a species that is threatened, endangered, and then if it gets extreme, maybe even extinct. Here in North America, the American buffalo is a prime example of an animal that was very, very numerous, and over time they were overhunted and a lot of times killed for no reasons at all. There were times in the 1800s where it was just like, shoot all the buffalo you can for sport. It's fun. Train might stop somewhere for a while, and for something to do, people would get out and shoot the buffalo, and that was seen as advantageous to the railroads because sometimes the buffaloes would get hit by the trains and so on and so forth. So there were a lot of reasons, and also in part of the persecution of Native Americans, that was one of the strategies was kill as many buffalo as you can because it was so much of a part of the Native Americans' way of making their living. So the American buffalo was hunted almost to extinction. Fortunately, protections were put in place for them before they became extinct, and their numbers are back up, and hopefully they'll be one day as numerous as they were. Due to conservation laws, a lot of species have been protected and probably saved from extinction. However, there are still many that come close to extinction or do come to extinction through illegal forms of hunting, which we refer to as poaching. This is a real problem in nations where it's really hard to enforce the hunting laws. And unfortunately, this affects animals like the rhinoceros and the elephants. Now, back to some positive notes. Properly regulated hunting can actually aid in biodiversity. It can control overpopulation of certain species. It can help keep the ecosystem evened out and keep the food webs healthy. Also, associated with legal hunting, there's often fees and license, and that money goes right back into the conservation efforts. So, like I was saying, sometimes hunting gets a bad rap from people who don't participate in it or don't understand it or don't know everything, enough about it. But it does have its positive points and some positive effects as long as it is being done in a responsible in a responsible manner. But the point of this slide is when it's in an unresponsible or totally unregulated manner, it can lead to extinction. Habitat fragmentation. This is something you rarely hear about, but some species are what they call like interior species. They do better in the middle of a large wilderness, such as what you see here in the middle here. You see you have like the bears and some birds. These would be like your species that do better deep in the wilderness. And then you have your kind of like edge habitat species here, and they kind of do better on the outsides of the wilderness areas. And what happens is when we build in certain areas or we build roads through areas, we end up taking a large habitat like this and we cut it into smaller sections like this. And this can really disrupt a lot of ecological processes such as breeding and predation, which is, of course, animals that hunt and eat other animals. And what ends up happening is that these interior habitat species, they become fewer in number. It really harms them. And then the edge habitat species, they can actually increase in number. And what this can do is disrupt the food web too. You have too many of one type, or several types of species, and not enough of these other ones, and it can kind of throw the balance of the ecosystem out of whack. So, and then also, just pretty much said this in my words without saying it outright, but biodiversity is decreased in this way. You have less organisms and less types of organisms, and this can also lead to extinction. This is particularly troublesome for large cat species like the Florida panther. That is a species that relies on vast areas of wilderness. They need to travel about the land as they hunt. And when the land is all fragmented like this, and there's cities and roads and so on and so forth, they just don't get by as well. They can't do their thing as successfully as they would be if they were in the middle of a vast wilderness. Here you can see ecosystem or habitat fragmentation here. You've got this road running right through here, and you can imagine before this road was built, these wooded areas, this was the same kind of area right here. But here you see this big road built through, and then you see these side roads built through, and there's probably houses down these paths as well. So you have habitat fragmentation there, and this would affect some of those species I was talking about earlier. Hey, and something else we can point out, we all know about this where we live. When you have all these areas like this, these places where these species have to cross, these animals have to cross, like you have a lot of animal strikes. We know about deer getting hit around here. We experience that fairly often. Most people have hit a deer. Most people have driven for a significant amount of time, have hit one or almost hit one, and that's a problem worldwide. This may be in the PowerPoint later. I can't remember, but if you ever travel around Europe, you'll see these bridges over a road like this, but the bridge is totally covered with plants and trees and things, and it looks like they just abandoned a bridge that they used to use. But these are actually wildlife bridges that they've built for animals to use to cross over areas like this. And the animals do tend to use them, and it really helps. It cuts down on animal strikes. That's something I really wish we would start doing more of here. Not only would that save animals, but it actually would help save us too in a way. I don't think it's all too common that a person dies in a car crash that involves hitting an animal, but it has happened. But also, it would save us a lot of trouble in the way of damaging our vehicles. Save us a lot of money, a lot of trouble. It'd save a lot of money on cleaning up carcasses off the road and so on and so forth. Biological magnification and bioaccumulation. This refers to the way in which pollutants build up in animals as you go up the food chain. So things like pesticides in particular build up in animal tissues. Let's say, like for example, in this picture here, they're talking about DDT, which is now banned, but it was a pesticide that was used that proved to be very, very harmful to biodiversity. So they're showing you here that in this water you have 0.00003 parts per million, And what that was referring to is how much DDT is dissolved in that water. Okay, so you have, that figure right there. And then you look, now you've got this zooplankton. These are the little organisms that are at the bottom of the food chain, more or less. And you can see the concentration of that DDT in them is higher than the concentration of the DDT in the water because it builds up in their bodies over time. Then you have these small fish that eat the zooplankton, and then you can see that they're at 0.5 parts per million pollution with DDT. So the pollution is built up even further in these. And then with the large fish, you're at 2 parts per million. That it just keeps going, and then you get to the bird here and it's at 25 parts per million. So as you go up, I mean, it just increases tremendously the amount of contaminant that just builds up in the tissue of these animals. And this is particularly harmful to these birds because it causes them to lay eggs where the shell is not strong enough, and then when the bird sits on the eggs to keep them warm, so they'll hatch properly, they end up breaking the eggs, and it's really hard for these birds to reproduce, and it has reduced their numbers tremendously. So this is another one of those things I talked about where we have successfully identified a problem we were causing and moved to correct it. We found out that DDT, which we were using as a pesticide, was way too harmful to all the other organisms, and so we discontinued its use. Here's a little more. This is kind of an entertaining story. It's kind of unfortunate, but I'll just read it to you. So DDT was the first modern insecticide. It was cheap, stayed active for a long time, and killed many different insects. It was used primarily to control agriculture pests and disease-carrying mosquitoes. In Borneo, DDT was used to kill mosquitoes. Lizards then ate the mosquitoes, and cats ate the lizards. Cats began to die off, and this is because of that bioaccumulation. Like every mosquito might have only had a little bit of the poison in them, but as the lizards ate multiple mosquitoes, the poison built up in them, and by the time some cats had ate a lizard or two, it was enough to kill the cats. So then with no cats, the rat population grew. This is what I was talking about in previous lessons, where I talk about when a species is removed from a food web, it throws the food web out of whack. Some species will become less successful, and others will become more successful, and that will further throw the balance of things off. And as this rat population grew, the rats began spreading disease. So to fix the problem, the World Health Organization come up with this really crazy idea, and they parachuted cats down into Borneo to replace the cat population and cut down on the rat population. So these cats were dropped in to eat the rats and get the ecosystem there back back in balance. So in the early 1950s, there was an outbreak of a serious disease called malaria amongst the Dayak people in Borneo. The World Health Organization tried to solve the problem. They sprayed large amounts of a chemical called DDT to kill the mosquitoes that carried the malaria. The mosquitoes died, and there was less malaria. That was good. However, there were side effects. The insects that died from being poisoned by DDT were eaten by gecko lizards, which were then eaten by cats. The cats started to die, the rats flourished, and people were threatened by outbreaks of two new serious diseases carried by the rats: sylvatic plague and typhus. To cope with these problems, which it had itself created, the World Health Organization had to parachute live cats into Borneo. Strange story. Sometimes truth really is stranger than fiction. I don't think I could have made up something like this. All right, a little more on DDT. Like I was saying, DDT causes birds to lay eggs with fragile shells, and it keeps birds from being able to reproduce in the numbers that they need to sustain their population. This was the case with the American bald eagle. It's been declared endangered since 1967. Fortunately, after banning DDT and making some other conservation efforts, the American bald eagle's numbers have increased, and now it is reclassified as threatened, meaning that their numbers are still pretty alarmingly low, but the threat of extinction is not quite as imminent as before. And hopefully they'll continue to grow in numbers, and eventually be, their populations will be large enough that they're no longer even considered threatened. Invasive species, we've talked about this in the previous lesson. When an invasive animal species enters a new habitat that it doesn't belong in, there may not be any predators or parasites to control its population, so that invasive species population can increase rapidly, disrupt food webs and habitats, and harm other species that are actually native to that environment. Examples I used in the last lesson were anacondas in Florida, kudzu in North Carolina, but there are also many other invasive species. There's a new one that's popping up around here, and it's this hammerhead worm. And I'm telling you, these things are disgusting. I hate to see them. It's this really long, skinny worm with like a hammer-shaped head, just like a hammerhead shark. I saw some of these in my backyard for the first time a month or so ago, and then started reading about it on the news. So it's really strange. I mean, I live pretty far out in the country, so I don't have a clue how they got there. Other than it probably has something to do with agriculture, but I believe they're from Asia, and here they are now. And I saw them in my yard, and then in a matter of weeks started reading news articles about them. So this happens, and that appears to be a new one for us. 1 out of every 5 species in North Carolina is considered to be threatened or endangered, and habitat loss is the leading cause. North Carolina is a popular state to move to. People from further down south want to move to it, and people from up north want to move to North Carolina. There's even a lot of people that get this idea that they want to move from up north, and they want to go live in Florida, and then they go live in Florida for a while, and for whatever reason they don't enjoy it, and instead of going all the way back up north, they come to North Carolina. And this state has it all. We got the mountains, we got the Piedmont, we got beaches, we got really nice beaches, we got the Outer Banks. It's a great place to live, and a lot of people are moving here, and as more people move here, we continue to develop and build, and cities are growing larger, and it's leading to a lot of habitat loss, and that's unfortunately a threat to our animal and plant species. Here's some examples of those endangered species here in North Carolina: the loggerhead sea turtle, the North Carolina flying squirrel, the fur moth spider, and the red-cocketed woodpecker. All right, so when we're talking about environmental issues, like I've said many times before, they're often politicized, and one of the main reasons for that is because there really is this balance we've got to figure out how to strike. We live this modern life now where we need jobs and we need certain resources and things, but we also understand our need to preserve nature from which all these resources come, and we're always trying to strike a balance. And I think most people have the right idea that we got to strike this balance. We can't abuse nature and continue to get by in the future. But as far as the political arguing goes, that's where it just seems like people totally forget, and some people are all about the business and the money only, and who cares about the rest of that stuff, and it just it's a very frustrating thing. It tends to affect people negatively too. Sometimes the arguments, a lot of misinformation gets out there, and people fail to realize, just what we stand to lose if we don't take care of our natural ecosystems and habitats. So really, though, what we need to realize is at the end of the day, you can't eat money, and if we destroy all our habitats, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many jobs there are or anything like that. I mean, we're all gonna be in danger. We're not going to be able to survive anymore. And I know that sounds extreme, but I mean that really is at the heart of it. No matter how artificial so many aspects of our lives seem to be, every resource that we use comes from nature. I've said before, one of the most unnatural seeming things is plastic. And indeed, that word plastic a lot of times is used to explain that something is fake or not natural. But actually, even plastic that comes from the ground. That's made from petroleum, the same thing our gasoline and oil and things are made of. And it may seem like the most unnatural thing in the world, but it still comes from the earth. All the materials we build our houses of comes from the earth. The materials our vehicles are made of, it comes from the earth. All of our food comes from the earth. We've got to protect all that, or we're not going to have any of these things. If we have no way to support our food needs and our water needs, we're not going to survive anymore. So we really, we have to take care of ourselves in terms of economy and our jobs and business and stuff. But it just, nature is more paramount than that in the end. It's just the way it is, and it's kind of unfortunate that there are a lot of people that don't realize that. Conserving biodiversity, we've talked about the fact that some of these species that are threatened or endangered, some of them, their numbers increase again because of conservation efforts. Well, these are some of the things that are done. If a species numbers get really low, scientists and zoologists, they will participate in what's called captive breeding. You take some of them animals out of nature. You get some males and some females, and you try to get them to reproduce as much as possible. You put them in a zoo or something, and then you try to support their reproduction efforts in any way possible. And this helps with a lot of species, but unfortunately, some species, it becomes very hard for them to breed in captivity. For whatever reason, they're less successful at breeding when they are in a zoo than when they're in nature. Apparently, that is the case with panda bears. They have a really hard time getting panda bears to successfully reproduce in a zoo setting. But it's absolutely essential that they make these captive breeding efforts, because the panda bears numbers are decreasing rapidly. If a species is not so close to extinction, but they're threatened, their numbers are a problem, scientists will often use tracking, which is where they tag animals in the wild, and it helps them count their numbers and know how many they got. So if they run across the same animal twice, they see that it's tagged, and they know that they've seen that animal before, and it helps them keep up with the population numbers and determine what other conservation efforts are necessary, such as captive breeding. Most of the time, protecting the habitat of the species and making sure that nobody is poaching any of the animals those are some of the most common methods for conserving biodiversity. Extinction, it happens. There are species that used to exist that no longer exist. There are many that cease to exist because their habitat changed naturally one way or the other. You've probably heard before that in the past, over the course of Earth's history, there have been sudden events that have caused mass extinction, such as the KPG boundary event, which is when a meteor hit the Earth right at the Yucatan Peninsula, and it was a large enough meteor that it caused a global event that killed off the dinosaurs and many other species. But today, a lot of the extinction occurs because of human activities. So here's some examples of some more recently extinct animals. We have the woolly mammoth, which is believed to have went extinct roughly, probably like near the end of the last ice age, 10,000 years ago or so, and its extinction came about because of too much hunting. Humans were hunting them. Humans were eating the woolly mammoth and using a lot of the other parts of its body as other materials that they needed to survive, and they just hunted their numbers too greatly, and they're gone now. We have the dodo bird up in the upper left-hand corner. I believe by the time humans came into contact with the dodo bird, they only lived on the island of Mauritius, which is off the coast. It's in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Africa. But they're extinct now, and that's thought to be due to human activity, humans hunting them too much. And then on the right, we have the Tasmanian tiger, which you also see referred to as the thylacine. It was seen as a threat to livestock, so they were purposely exterminated for the most part. People were encouraged to hunt them and kill as many as possible. Ever so often in Australia, these are native to Australia or were native to Australia. Ever so often, somebody will claim to have seen one, but it's really hard to verify that. So I would like to think maybe there's still one out there. It would be nice to find out there's one less, extinct species out there. But also, look how cool those things are. I don't know of any other animal quite like that. They're pretty amazing. Um, so I hope there are still some out there. That would be nice to know. But they're definitely thought to be extinct and have. I think the last one was believed to have died in captivity in the 1930s. Here's some species that are endangered today. We have the silverback gorilla, the white rhinoceros, and panda bears that I talked about before.